As of the 4th of March 2025, a brand new patch has been dropped for Project Zomboid and the Build 42 unstable branch. So in today's video, I'll be going over everything you need to know about the most recent patch. There were a lot of balancing changes in this one, as well as a couple of prominent new additions that you'll want to hear about. There were close to 600 lines of text in these patch notes, so while I'll do my best to pick out the important stuff, there will of course be things I've opted not to include, and if you want to read the full patch notes, there will be a link in the description. Like and subscribe for more Project Zomboid news, mods, and gameplay videos like this one, and with all that out of the way, let's start with the new additions from the 42.4.0 update. So, the very first of the new additions, and arguably the most important of the lot, raccoons have now been added to the game as furry little critters. They have some issues with their ability to climb fences currently, but aside from that, they should be fully functional. I'll be interested to see if we can make them domesticated in any sense, or whether they'll interact with our safe houses in any way. I'd really love if they could maybe create extra trash piles or steal our food from stores once in a while, but time will tell how they're going to interact with the world around them. There are now 5 new readable flyers you can pick up and collect in-game and use to track down some more valuable loot locations. Many more controller support features have been added in this update. Crafting windows are now usable, chicken coops, trailers, and butchering hooks should be much more easy to use, crafting benches are now supported, the fluid transfer system is now supported, flyers and newspaper windows the same, and much more on top of that. All said and done, players using controllers should now have a much better time with Build 42. Research progression for metal armor, both scrap welded and proper blacksmith stuff, has now been added to the game. A missing recipe for a forged spade head has also been added. Some animations for the transition from sprinting to aiming a weapon have been added, alongside a couple of new rifle aiming animations as well. New sound effects have now been brought in for the old-fashioned generators, sitting in chairs and opening or closing wood log gates. There is now some new audio for when chickens are eating as well, to make your farms a little bit more lifelike. 2 new biomes have now been added to the game, one when you are close to a lake and the other when you are close to a river. Many new additions have been made to the foraging tables as well, this time focusing on wild plants, herbs, insects, and most seed-bearing plants. This is going to be useful for gathering seeds for our own farms or greenhouses if we're unable to find seed packets in lootable locations. There's also a new artifacts category for foraging finds, which according to the patch notes are very rare and are only found outside of towns. As for what kind of item this might include, we're going to have to wait and see. Items on the sidebar can now be scaled in the settings, just like the Moodles, so we can customize our UI. No doubt especially beneficial for those on higher resolution monitors. A vehicle alarm script property has now been added to allow a different sound for car alarms than the horn. If the alarm sound isn't specified, then the horn sound is used instead. Rain collectors now have an added function that allows them to be filled when the player is away from their safe house. Some players have been using mods for this so far, but they will now no longer be needed. It isn't mentioned if this also applies to troughs, so if anybody has some time to test this, let me know down in the comments how that functions. New animal behaviors mean that they now recognize rivers, lakes, and ponds. They will now drink from these water sources before anything else, so long as the body of water is contained within their animal zone. So in essence, it will be a very good idea to build animal enclosures next to water, since you won't need to worry about building or managing the water levels of troughs. Various other additions to animal behavior have been made as well, such as allowing them to look around instead of purely under their feet as they do now, and changes to some eating behaviors, though there's no specification of that further in these patch notes. Improvised screwdrivers have now been added to the game, meaning we have an alternative to simply finding them when we're looting. As many will know, these are a fundamental crafting item that can be used for mechanics, carpentry, and are generally considered a very sought after item for that reason. Firewood, firewood bundles, and firewood with nails have now been added as items. Firewood burns for longer than other wood items in relation to their weight, meaning that you can extend the duration a fire will be burning by using the proper wood types. You can chop either branches or logs into firewood, and they will also produce wooden splinters, meaning meaning that you'll always get some tinder that you can use to actually light the fire itself as well. Now, several new crafting recipes have been added, included but not limited to leather tool rolls, carved wooden goblets, improvised knife from a machete blade, wooden rods from long sticks, tree branches from saplings, a new twig broom item, a new flint saw item, carving of bone and wooden knitting needles, being able to saw wooden baseball bats into short bats, and last but by certainly no means least, a whole host of recipes dedicated to processing and forging metal items. So we'll actually be able to find a use now for all that silver and gold jewelry you'll come across in the world. Now, there's a fair bit more in the way of new recipes that have been added in this update, and I'd be here all day going through every single one. So what I've done here is collected them all up, and I'll add them to the list you're seeing on screen, which will be kept up and available for the next few seconds. If you want to pause the video to have a look over all of these items, please feel free to do so now before we move on. Some of the more major ones that affect fundamental gameplay mechanics we may have already touched on or will touch on later. Lastly, in the new additions section, there has been a hotfix patch since the main update that has brought in 3 new traits. Mason, which provides 2 levels in masonry, Inventive, which reduces the skill level requirements for research, and Artisan, which provides 1 level in glassmaking and pottery. Okay, now we're on to the balancing section of the patch notes. Several changes to XP gains have been made in this patch, which is worth mentioning because it will no doubt affect how easy or difficult it is for players to grind out certain skills that are still seeing new additions. For example, making stones from large stones now gives more masonry XP than it did previously. Using masonry to make stone blocks from stones now requires masonry 1 and provides XP equivalent to that level requirement. Small and large stone wheels and stone anvils are now level 2, which the developers hope will allow for somewhat easier leveling of the skill and more functionality in the earlier levels. They mentioned that some of the recipes may be placed at higher levels later, but that this is an initial rebalancing pass. In other skill trees, filleting a fish will now provide butchering XP, not cooking XP, as it has previously. This should make leveling that skill significantly easier if you're stocking your freezer full of fish for the winter. XP has been removed from researching items, and as a nice quality of life change, if a weapon will not generate maintenance XP, there is now a tooltip that warns the player this is the case, so you'll know at a glance. Constructing tiles now grants more XP in all cases. For the most part, this will be 10 XP per level of skill requirement, with 0 skill tiles giving between 1 and 6 XP. The developers do make a note here that this change was made because previously it was far more productive to destroy tiles rather than to make them, and they hope this will encourage building rather than dismantling. Campfires have now had their capacity increased. This was done to ensure that buckets can be used for the purification of water and should make that process considerably easier. A couple of balancing changes have been made for crafted and primitive weaponry. The theme here seems to be that some weapons could be very easily made, but were too close to the stats of their manufactured counterparts. They are intended to be crude, handmade items, and thus some nerfs have been put in place to ensure that they fit the part they are meant to play. For example, wooden spades have been nerfed, and the requirements to craft large stone axe heads or stone maul heads have been increased by 1 level, following a nerf to their stats in a previous update. The looted buildings that you'll see as time goes on in your playthroughs will now always have the downstairs windows unlocked. This ensures that you won't have any of those weird instances where you can't get into a building that has clearly already been looted by someone, which of course doesn't really make much sense. On a similar token, the downstairs doors and windows will now often be destroyed in these scenarios to make for a more obvious signaling that it is indeed a looted building. Several other changes have been made to the looted building stories, such as trash spawning in the area immediately surrounding the structure, corpses spawning just outside them, and the basement levels of these buildings being less looted proportionate to how many levels below ground the basement is. Butchering of animals has seen a couple of balancing changes in these patch notes. There is one addition that simply says balanced butchering further, which I'll be honest tells us absolutely nothing, and some of the other noted changes are less than specific too, which read balanced butchering meat given, for example. I'd hazard an educated guess that this is because there's been some feedback that butchering animals doesn't really seem worth it in terms of calories and nutritional gain compared to simply living off their produce introduce, but I am taking a guess here because it's just not specified in the patch notes. I'd be interested to see if anyone has been able to do their own research on this so far and find out a bit more about butchering yields with the new update. On a similar note, the quality and quantity of butchered meat will now be reduced by the passing of time since an animal's death to replicate the process of the corpse rotting. If the animal has stayed dead for too long before being butchered, that meat can now also come back as rotten when carved from the animal. Lastly, killing an animal with a vehicle will now result in significantly less meat from the carcass and that of poor quality, which I think is a great change because killing an animal with a vehicle so far has been the preferred method for many, and that just doesn't seem quite right. Sledgehammers can now be found as surface level clutter in farm storage and garage rooms, which I would think will make them significantly more common considering how many houses have garages attached to them. But this is one that, again, time will tell and we'll need to see how it plays out. On top of that, some appropriate vehicles will now have sledgehammers as part of their possible loot found in the trunk. Interestingly, some changes have been made to how drunkenness and unhappiness affect a character. In the new update, if you're at max mood or level for either of these two things, it will take your character twice as long to finish any timed actions, so it'll be more important than ever to try and manage these status effects. Okay, so that brings us nicely to the fixes in this update, and there are a ton of these, so for many of these I would recommend going and checking the full patch notes for yourself if you want to read them all in detail, but I will quickly cover some of the biggest ones that are worth knowing for you guys now. Some missing vehicle mechanics overlays for several vehicles have now been fixed. Some issues with the fluid transfer system that would see certain liquids transformed into water, whatever they were previously, have now been fixed, so you'll always get the same liquid as the one you put in. Stone axes will now see their condition reduced appropriately when chopping trees. Previously there was an issue allowing these to last for an infinite amount of time. Issues where the thirst of a character would reach negative values have now been fixed, so you'll only ever be able to go as low as 0. Previously, when eggs were frozen, sometimes they would never defrost again. That has now been fixed in this update, so you can freeze them without having to worry. Some containers that wouldn't fill properly when left in the rain have now been fixed so that they fill appropriately. Now, apparently, pain was accidentally capped at a value of 1, when it should have been capped at 100. This has now been fixed in this update, so pain is coming your way, and you may need to make adjustments with your playstyle to accommodate any injuries your characters get. There was previously an issue where some poisonous mushrooms or berries would sometimes be missing the poisonous tag, creating incredibly frustrating deaths with seemingly no cause. If this happened to you, you'll be glad to know that this is now fixed in this update. Some issues where the character would get stuck in place have now been fixed, and there have been several performance-based fixes relating to things like severe freezing when right-clicking inventories with hundreds of nails in them, or stutters when right-clicking large quantities of items on the ground. Most importantly of all of these fixes, however, we will now be able to pet raccoons, which the patch notes specifically state as heresy that this couldn't be done before. Now, very quickly, just as a final thing before I start to wrap up this video that I haven't seen in the patch notes themselves, and I'd like to say a very special thank you to my friend Mr. Lamprey for pointing this out to me. It looks as though water wells and water pumps have been changed yet again. These incredibly rare water pumps were previously able to supply clean water. It now provides tainted water, exactly the same as the water wells. Whether this was an intentional change or a bug, and I'm hoping it's the latter, we don't know, but it's something you should definitely be aware of before jumping back into your playthroughs. So that's just about everything that you will need to know from the huge list of patch notes for the 42.4.0 update for Project Zomboid, and as such, that's all from me for today. But if you'd like to read the full patch notes, again, there is a link in the description. I'd also like to mention that we're starting a fresh multiplayer wipe on our whitelisted Patreon server as of Saturday the 8th, so if you've been thinking about supporting the channel on Patreon for some time, now is a great time to join my fantastic community of supporters that help me to do what I do best and get in on a fresh playthrough. Special thank you to all of my existing supporters on Patreon, and I will see you guys in the next one.